Hello and welcome to this week's What Were They Thinking? Among the news items we have for you this week, alarm bells are being rung in the UK regarding a reasonably common anti-anxiety medication. There is evidence that planting trees to compensate for CO2 emissions and global warming could actually have the opposite effect, albeit very tenuously. Mexico has delayed choices regarding the ban on glyphosate use, as you may more commonly know it, Roundup. Organic farming is already known to be a terrible choice, but there's actual harm being shown in at least one study. An interesting article from Quillette about why chess as a competitive activity is dominated by males. And we have what is arguably a unconventional superconductor, but importantly, it has been found occurring naturally. The timestamps for these and other news items can be found in the description box below. Starting with news that might give you anxiety, so you now have reason to take the anti-anxiety medication at the cause of it, we have a common medication in the UK. It's called pregabalin. It was, in 2018, linked to 187 deaths, which isn't great. But the alarm bells are being rung because in 2022 it more than doubled to 441 deaths. This isn't great, but it's not the end of the world either. Which is why people saying that it's effectively the UK's equivalent of the US opioid epidemic are kind of overselling the problem. Yes, people dying is bad, but selling it as an equivalent to what's happening in the USA is rather ridiculous. What the USA is seeing with opioids is by far and away far worse. The reason this medication is being, used illicitly is, a part of its unexpected or at least unintended effects. These are feelings of euphoria, calmness, and relaxation, which, given it's meant to be a sedative, the last of these kind of makes sense. Normally, though, you'd be using it for things like epilepsy and anxiety, not to feel euphoria, and therein lies the problem. It's the increasing use of it illicitly or without a prescription to get that positive effect. The effect alone, at least for some people, just isn't enough, and this is what's contributing to the significant rise in deaths. About 90%, if not more, of the deaths associated with this have been tied to the use of other medications which, when used together, have, the negative effect of death. Generally speaking, death is at least one permanent way to get your anxiety solved. Generally speaking, it's probably not the best way to do it, but it's an option, at least for these roughly 441 people in 2022. Shifting from drug-related problems to what can be best described as environmental and epidemiological news, we have bird flu infecting cows. This might seem odd. Why cows? And it's really more having to do with exposure risk more than anything else. It's the same reason why there's a significant risk that bird flu becomes swine flu. There's a certain amount of exposure for pigs. In this case, in Texas in the USA and Kansas in the USA, we have cows, at least 4 different locations, coming up positive for avian influenza or bird flu. What has people worried is that one of the things they detected was that the bird flu was in the cow's milk, and that's a worry. Not necessarily a worry in that you're going to get infected since the cow's milk is going to be pasteurized, but it's a worry if you consume unpasteurized or basically raw milk, because that could have a live influenza within it. It's another reason why raw milk is a ridiculous and stupid idea, and why pasteurization, when it was developed, was a massive health benefit. So we have not only a perfectly viable solution to this, and therefore we're never going to have to worry about it if you consume pasteurized milk, but the issue is not that. The issue here is the effect it has on milk production. Therein lies the crux of the problem. On average, about 10% of the herd in each particular dairy farm was affected by avian influenza. However, the effect it has on the cattle production of milk can be anywhere up to 40%. That drop in production can last between 7 and 10 days, and arguably a little bit less or a little bit longer, but nonetheless, a 40% reduction in milk, even intermittently, is a big problem, especially if it comes through every year as different strains of influenza make their way into the world. The only other major element to this is that it appears to be caused, arguably, by migrating birds. This means that the birds responsible will be moving across different states, and as they move, they may cause other states to experience exactly the same phenomena, which means we effectively have a massive moving cause of contagion that will gradually travel across the USA. Shifting to plant news, we have what could be an unintended consequence of trying to push back against climate change, global warming, or whatever you wish to call it. That is, by planting your trees in the wrong places, and particularly in the wrong way, you could theoretically be contributing to an increase in climate change instead of mitigating it. Yes, the irony is strong with this. The idea is fundamentally, you plant a tree, the tree takes CO2 from the atmosphere, water from the ground, and sunlight, and it makes growth, thereby reducing CO2 levels. However, the issue here is very simple. If you have trees planted in the wrong way, particularly if you have more trees planted, that is a excess density of trees, rather than the sunlight being reflected back into space, we instead have it not only absorbed by the plant, but also getting trapped below the plant. Therefore, the heat cannot escape. This would, at least in theory, cause an increase in global climate conditions, which is, well, kind of unfortunate. This is a phenomenon called albedo, or more specifically, a decreased albedo. No, a different kind of albedo. What's important for this is that between 20 and 80% increases are observed when you increase density of tree planting, and this is a massive point that policymakers need to take into account when they're looking at ways to fund or provide incentives for trees. Next we have a news building on last week, where last week we explained that orcas or killer whales were causing trouble with increasingly creative and effective means of hunting. One of the things they like to hunt are sperm whale calves, mostly because they're small and they're delicious. They're kind of like veal. In this case, sperm whales, given that they're being attacked by orcas, have decided that's enough of that nonsense, and now are finding ways to respond. In this case, it's Australia, which really is not that surprising. Everything in Australia tries to kill you, and now we can add whales and orcas to that list. The solution that the sperm whale has come to is to effectively poop in the face of the orca. But it's not just poop, it's diarrhea, and it is more or less shot out like explosive diarrhea. And for some strange reason, or perhaps not so strange, the orcas are not fond of being exposed to this. Mostly because it's kind of like being in a pool where somebody has pooped themselves. Nobody wants to go back in that water, ever. Consequences of being pooped on causes the orcas to effectively run away, or at least according to these observations. In fact, not only do those that are pooped on run away, but then so does the rest of the pod, herd, however you wish to call them. Shifting to nature now, we have more news, but specifically agricultural news, around the use of glyphosate. Glyphosate is one of the most common and effective herbicides that are used to kill weeds, particularly in terms of farming. You can still buy it for domestic use, although decreasingly so. There's just this strange pushback not to do so. Despite that, it is still very common across the world. The European Union, America, Australia, Canada, all sorts of countries have approved it. Mexico was looking to ban its use. However, the problem is very simple. Mexico cannot find an alternative for glyphosate, and therein lies the problem. The intention had been to phase out and stop its use by April 1st of this year. That's a few days away from the time this video is being written. As a result, you can't use it, or at least you weren't meant to use it. But because there's no alternative, Mexico has had to say, well, we have to extend the time frame for this. The whole reason why Mexico was looking to find an alternative, and arguably still is down to the World Health Organization's listing of it as probably carcinogenic. Understand, that was the IARC determination. The actual risk of glyphosate causing this, according to other World Health organizations, is that it's actually very unlikely to cause it. Or at least the risk of cancer from it is very small. And so you have what could be kindly described as conflicting reports. As such, it makes sense to look for an alternative. After all, it's always better to find something better. But in this case, they're trying to find something better based on bad research, and further, not only is it bad research, but bad research that's conflicting. Where glyphosate is controversial, we have, albeit nowhere near as controversial, but nonetheless still, you would have naysayers who scream about the evils of genetic modification. And those same people are likely to be wringing their hands and crying out because of new research that has found a way to better be able to modify not only plants, although they're the major target, arguably other things as well. In this case, they're using a combination of the herpes virus, bacteriophages, and the Cas9 or CRISPR technologies. Cas9 being the foundation to CRISPR. What they've done is take a herpes virus, and in other cases the tobacco mosaic virus, and they've been able to use these for things like Arabidopsis and for wheat, and significantly increase the effect of either adding in or taking out certain genes, known as a knockout or knock-in. This means that, in theory, based on this research at least, you could have a huge increase in the ability to not only cheaply but effectively make plants, well, genetically modified, but importantly, it's not just genetically modifying them once, it's modifying them in a heritable manner. This means that you could, in effect, cause a complete change in the gene sequence of any subsequent plants that come from these. That allows you to modify, say, bananas to be resistant to the fungal infections that are causing problems across the world. And you're not going to have anywhere near the kind of effects of off-target results, damage to them, and so on. That's the other advantage to this. It's not just that you get a heritable and very easily done modification, but that you don't have anywhere near the kind of damage that you might expect to see. Shifting to news that takes the last two items and explains why not only is genetically modifying food necessary, but that things like glyphosate are also necessary. It's all about why organic farming could actually have more harmful effects than big organic farming would have you think. The whole thing is based on research published this week, and it's that, well, first of all, expanding cropland, which is necessary for organic farming, leads to not just issues around increased pesticide use, but it significantly counters any kind of environmental benefits that organic farming may claim to have. One thing to point out is that just because it says organic doesn't mean that there are no pesticides used. Organic farming does use pesticides, and importantly, what they use tend to be very nasty by comparison to things like glyphosate, ironically enough. As a result, the effect of spraying these particularly nasty chemicals to kill off herbs and pests can spill over to other farms. Now, understand, these effects do come with certain benefits, such as an improvement in soil and water quality in some instances, but those benefits need to be weighed against the actual harms that they generate. Now, this research is likely to have people angry and crying out, well, the study's flawed, or this, that, and the other. But we can at least say that it's a decent study, albeit limited in its geographical scope. First of all, it was looking at 14,000 fields, which isn't a great way of describing how much area, but at least we know roughly what they were trying to examine. It was run across 7 years, so this is not a short time frame. The kind of things that they examined in those fields included grapes, watermelons, citrus, tomatoes, potatoes, and others again. This means that we're not also talking about a study limited in its applicability. It seems to apply to just about every kind of crop that is grown, although likely not to include things like corn and wheat at this stage. The results as they are both obvious and not obvious. The obvious effect is that pesticide use on conventional farms nearby to organic farms went up, which, given the organic farm doesn't really use pesticides as much, means that they would harbour pests that find their way to the conventional fields, so not surprising there. What is unexpected is that nearby organic fields had a lower use of pesticides. This means you can think of organic farm fields as being kind of like an impact site, and this is what they found. The further you are from where the impact starts, the less you need to worry about it, and same thing with conventional farms. They had less pesticide use the further away they were. The very short version of all this research is that if you intermingle conventional and organic farming, you have problems. If you cluster each of these together, you don't. But you would also need to separate the two with some sort of boundary to prevent issues around what you could consider cross-contamination. Going to other environmental news, but this time it's all related to diseases, and specifically Legionnaires' disease. Legionnaires' disease is a particular and somewhat unique form of pneumonia. What it does is it particularly affects the lungs, and it's nasty by itself. Arguably not the worst kind of pneumonia you can get, but quite high up in the risk hierarchy. The concern here is very simply that there has been, at least since about 2000-ish, a tenfold increase, or thereabouts, in America of cases of Legionnaires' disease, and Europe and Canada aren't much better with up to a 7-fold increase. That's a problem, not just because, as mentioned, it's a particularly nasty kind of infection to get, and treatment is, well, not fun at the best of times, but there's a very simple reason why it's happening. Well, we say a simple reason, but to be clear, this is an observational study looking back over the last 30 or so years of data, and importantly, while it's observational, it can only establish a correlation, not necessarily causation. What they found was that as the levels of sulfur dioxide in the air went down, the rate of Legionnaires' disease went up. This does make a lot of sense, particularly as sulfur dioxide can be used as a very effective, let's say, a sanitizing agent. It kills off the bacteria causing Legionnaires' disease. This would explain that as sulfur dioxide levels went down, Legionnaires' disease went up, and you get consequential infections. Exactly how clear-cut the relationship is, although well correlated, does not necessarily mean that it is perfectly true. This is down to one other element, that is, Not only is it limited to pretty much New York State, but they found that proximity to cooling towers, for example, those used for power plants, had a significant impact on their relationship. So the more close you are to a cooling tower, the higher the risk. But also, you then have to account for sulfur dioxide, and things begin to get more complicated as multiple factors begin to stack up. Going from the impact of organic farming, which by itself is controversial, to other controversial news, decisions by the Swiss chess governing body about whether or not trans women can compete in the female category of, chess competitions. In short, FIDE, or the Fédération Internationale des Échecs, has come to the conclusion, at least for the next 2 years while they conduct further analysis and understanding of what they're going to be doing in the future, that trans women cannot compete in the female category of chess, or the women's category. Instead, they are required to participate in the open category. To be clear, there are only two categories: the women's category and the open category. There is no male grouping as such. It's simply that if you want to play against everybody, you go in the open. If you want to go into the women's category, you have to be a female. And herein lies the controversy, not just for the fact that, not everybody agrees with the decision, but all the arguments for and against, and Quillette does provide a good example of whether or not this is appropriate, because it goes through a lot of the arguments, and not just the differences in the personalities and thought patterns involved, but to a certain extent, whether or not there is a reason why women are underrepresented, let's say, in chess. They do try and make various arguments based on very limited studies that women simply don't feel welcome. For example, they use a 2010 study which had young girls put into a chess club that was voluntary, and that within a few months only 10% of the girls who were taking part remained. Many of them left simply down to boredom. Others left because their friends had left, and then others again left because they felt that they were pressured by the fact that, they're considered hopeless, which, to be blunt with you, that's kind of male banter. There's a distinction between how males engage with males, and to a degree how males engage with females in a setting where there are other males. It's the same sort of environment you would have with, say, tabletop gaming, like Warhammer. You tend to get to an environment where there are a lot of males, and the males just act like they would with other males in the same setting, even if somebody's a female, which is different to what a female might be used to. And this is another example they use, that is, because there was a female in a chess club, they got unwanted male attention. It's the almost trope-like depiction of nerds of, there's a female, oh god, there's a female. Yeah, that's pretty much typical, because it's an anomaly. The same way people might want to see a train wreck. It's not ideal, but because it's so weird and unusual, people want to see it. It's not to say it's a good thing, but that is just human nature. There is a strong case to be made that the sexism as it exists now is not necessarily against females, or rather, it's against males who don't have a category of their own. The fact that men are forced to compete in an open category rather than having a category of their own would indicate that they're expected to just deal with it. On the other hand, giving women a category of their own does ensure that they are playing in an environment in which they feel comfortable, safe, and have a equal opportunity. If they want to compete in the open category, they're free to do so. There's nothing that stops them from doing that. Where this gets messy, let's say, is when you look at rankings or ratings. Ratings are effectively how well you've performed in your chess matches, or games if you so wish to call them that. For the most part, Females have at least on average, a significantly lower rate of success than males do. And so if they have a lower rating, their probability of winning is also lower. Because of this, you can make a strong case that putting a male who does have the advantage of being higher rated into a women's match where the average is lower gives them an unfair advantage. It's, in a manner of speaking, very similar to something like, say, Age of Empires, where if you play online, you'd be aware of the ELO. ELO is basically the same idea, that is, how well do you score? And as you would see with Age of Empires Online, if you're playing multiplayer matches, a high ELO player has a very good chance, if not almost definitive chance, of winning against multiple lower ranked players. That is, if a high scoring player plays against a group of low scoring players and they're all against that one individual, they can still win. And it does indicate that there is a significant difference in whether or not ELO or your rating within the chess field drastically affects the ability of others to not only be able to play, but have an equal chance to win and enjoy the game. There is also one more element to this that the article does go into depth on that we want to mention, and that is the greater male variability hypothesis. That is, that males have a greater variability in how widespread the traits are amongst males. Effectively, there are going to be more idiot males and more genius males, because it's a flatter curve. By contrast, the females have a much tighter clustering of traits. That is, you get more average females and a tighter clustering, so you'll have only a smaller percentage of geniuses, but they tend to be a more high peak in the center, whereas males are like a mound flattened out. Effectively, what you see when you look at the flattening the curve for COVID, males are like the flattened curve. This is also another reason why you tend to see them in STEM fields. Also why you tend to see them in not so intelligent type occupations. Labourers, for example. It's not to say they're dumb, just not as, let's say, gifted or skilled. The same phenomena might well be exactly the same thing we're seeing in chess. This may also explain why we see more males involved in chess than we do females. If you have more males exhibiting the relatively limited number of traits required for chess to be an appealing activity to them and to later perform well, you're going to see them overrepresented because there are more males at that end of the spectrum where it is a more dominant trait, versus females where, because the bell curve is more narrow, there are fewer females who not only exhibit those traits, but also that they may not have the traits to the same extent. This would further support the variability hypothesis and why not only segregated categories is better, but it gives those involved the best opportunity. The Quillette essay goes through a great deal more detail and is certainly worth a read to look at a reasonably balanced and fairly thorough analysis of the factors that affect female participation and success in competitive chess. Next we have what is honestly unusual and weird news, and that is the melting glaciers, icebergs, and all sorts of other solid water is affecting the length of our year. Yeah, this is odd, and once you understand what's happening, it makes a lot more sense, but it's still bizarre. What's happening is that as the ice melts, it's changing the rate at which the Earth spins, which does work out when you look at how the ice turns into water and that water moves. Now, we're not talking leap year degrees of change just yet, but we also don't have all the ice melted, so with the sheer amount of ice mass that could still be turned into water, it's a concern. To be clear, it's even likely that sometime between 2026 and 2029, those that are relying on very accurate timekeeping will actually need to adjust all of their devices to account for this change in Earth rotation speed. The reason that this scenario gets to be important is very simply that things like satellites in orbit rely on the ability to reconcile their position above Earth with what is on Earth. But if they're rotating at a speed in such a way that they're falling very slowly behind, albeit in terms of years to get a single second, you have a problem. They aren't going to be aligned in the right place at the right time to be able to do what needs to be done. The final news item we have for you this week is a bizarre discovery of a natural superconductor, but it's not a superconductor in the same terms you might think of it. Rather, it is very unconventional, and that makes it both bizarre and useful as a research tool and development. The superconductor is called a myocyte, and as said, it occurs naturally in nature, but it can also be entirely synthesized in the laboratory, and this means that we're not going to have to worry about having to find natural sources of it. Where this gets useful is that the naturally occurring product is pure enough to act as a superconductor, which is where this is weird. It's not necessarily useful, but weird and therefore can be helpful for physicists, engineers, and so on. The other useful element to this is that where most superconductors are incredibly difficult to make, very reliant on purity of what you're doing, and often made of a single element, if not a mixture of elements in very, very particular ways, this is a fairly straightforward superconductor requiring rhodium and sulfur. This is much simpler to make and source, at least to an extent, thereby meaning that if you were to use these superconductors for high-demand items like MRI scanners or machines, you would be able to use them and they'd be much cheaper. That's all the news we have for you this week. Thank you for watching. If you found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. And please do post any comments, questions, or suggestions you have below.